Good evening and welcome to Dementia Diaries, a caregiver's journey. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm looking forward to meeting with my guests this evening. Just so everyone knows, this is a free all talk show about caregivers that are taking care of patients with dementia or some type of dementia, or those that have taken care of those individuals. So the purpose is to learn and provide some guidance and recommendations that others have used in their care for their loved ones. So at this time, I am going to bring on our guest this evening, and her name is Betsy Haddad. Betsy, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. If you take a few moments to just tell us something about yourself.
Sure. I am 55 years old. I am originally from Connecticut and I now live in Florida. I moved here in my 20s to live close to my parents. That turned out to be a wise choice. I work for Florida Blue and I have two young adult sons. One is 21, one is 19, and I am the daughter and former caregiver of an Alzheimer's patient. Dad died in February of 2022.
Aw. So, and his name is Edward, correct?
Yes.
Yes. You're in Florida. I live in Florida as well. I am close to the Tampa Bay area. So hopefully you're not too far away.
Central.
Okay, okay. Awesome. So let's talk about your father for a moment, if you don't mind. First of all, you said he had Alzheimer's and he passed away in February of last year.
Yes.
Tell me, when and how long had he had the disease?
So, dad had some family history of Alzheimer's on his mother's side, and a couple of his father's siblings also had dementia. So, his mother had died of Alzheimer's, and it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. My father kept journals. He was a great writer. And about 2009, his journal entries show that he was beginning to be afraid that he was showing signs. He was still working as a consultant at that time. He was retired, but he had a really nice little job that he loved at the Orlando Science Center. And he started making a lot of mistakes at work, and he was humiliated by that and ended up having to give that up. By 2012, he couldn't put it off any longer. And with the support of my mother, he went and got a formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 2012. He was one of the first participants in the Eli Lilly clinical trial for the Aduhelm drug. He's really proud to contribute to the science. And that drug worked really well for him during the time he was able to take it. But then, that drug was only useful in the early stages. Then that wore off, and he progressed to the middle stage and the late stage. And after about 10 years, he died in 2022.
Okay. I don't know what Mike is doing the echo. I don't know if you all can hear it or not, but there is an echo.
Uh-oh.
So, but anyway, so you said that he was writing in his journal and he himself could tell that something was going on.
Yeah.
What about you and your
Well,
siblings you having?
yeah, my mom was really the canary in the coal mine. She was, of course, his constant caregiver and support. My mom was very intelligent and educated, and of course, they'd been through this before with dad's mother. So my mother saw these signs early, was very proactive with his health, and strongly encouraged him to get tested. He found out he was diagnosed officially at age 69, and he died at 79. So for myself, I didn't see those signs early on. My mother was, I think, helped shield us a little bit from that. And my brother, I just have one sibling, and he lives in New Jersey, and he really didn't see signs of that at all. But my mother brought him up to speed pretty quick.
Okay. And the dementia that he had, was it genetic or
Well, He did get that test, as part of the clinical trial, he was tested for what they call the APOE marker. He didn't have that marker. However, his mother did have the disease. So I guess in that sense, we felt there was a family history, but it wasn't through the only known genetic marker that we have. Maybe it was just luck of the draw. I don't I guess the science wasn't clear enough to tell us that.
And what type? Vascular? What type of dementia do you know?
He didn't have his brain tested after he died. My mother wished after the fact that she had donated the brain, because with the current science we have, I think that a brain test after death is sometimes the only way they can actually be sure what type it was.
Mhm.
It was not vascular or Lewy body. It was the more common form of dementia that he was diagnosed with.
Okay. Okay. Now, when you found out that your dad had dementia, um, what was your reaction?
Oh, that's a great question. Was so close to my dad, and at first, I just was kind of in disbelief. He seemed so high functioning at that time. He was a fabulous person, a musician. I know you've all read in the news about Tony Bennett, who just died of Alzheimer's at 96, mind you. My dad was a musician like that. He was a piano player and a singer, a fabulous entertainer, smart man, great writer, a stage actor. In his spare time, very social, very charming. There just wasn't any sign to me. Of course, I didn't observe him at his work, but we couldn't see any signs of that. It was mostly my mother telling us and then telling us about the diagnosis. So I think my brother and I were sort of in disbelief in the beginning.
Okay. And do you have a sense of how long it took for you to kind of adjust? Because there is that adjustment period, of, okay, this is what it is, and this is what we have to do.
That period, I think in my brother's case and mine, it is probably about 4 years. In 2012, when he got the official diagnosis, man, it was sort of like things were going so well. We just couldn't believe it. In fact, that year, I took a Disney cruise with my parents and my sons who were young at the time, and it was so great. Looking back on it, I realize now that my parents probably thought, wow, we need to do these things while we can. But I didn't see it that way. I was just having a great time. So I enjoyed that for everything it was worth. And I saw my father all the time. I lived here in Florida with them, only about 10 miles away. So it really, I think, wasn't until about 2016, about 4 years later, that I really started to see this is setting in. By 2016, my parents had joined several support groups, and my father was starting to participate in the local walk to end Alzheimer's. And I have a really good picture of him and my mother from that walk in their t-shirts from 2016. And my father in that picture, his face looked really thin and drawn and serious. And when I looked at that picture, it reality set in for me, more than any other time. I think by that 4 years later period, and thereafter it was just a battle with how to help my mother care for him. My brother was largely removed because he was in New Jersey.
Mhm. So, talking about the caregiving piece, and you lived about 10 minutes away, 10 minutes? Yes. How did your mother and you handle that? Was she there? I mean, of course, she lived there, but did she have an aide come in? Was he, initially home and then moved to a care institution, or how did that play out?
Oh my gosh, Janet, we tried everything. Oh my gosh, I feel like we not intentionally, of course, but like we made every mistake and we tried everything to see if it would work. So in the beginning, of course, my parents thought that it could be managed at home. They had a long-term care insurance policy. They didn't realize at that time that that policy only paid a full benefit if my father would be institutionalized. It didn't pay the full benefit if they would have someone in to care for them. My parents being part of what's called the silent generation, born in the early 1940s, they're very thrifty, very responsible with their money, and they were well off. They weren't wealthy, but they certainly were responsible with their money. And my mother just didn't want to pay for someone to come in and didn't like the idea of having someone in her house. So they put that off probably longer than they should have. So my mother was trying to manage this care by herself at home all of the time. Of course, I saw them frequently, but my mother was very stoic, not a complainer, never let on to me how difficult difficult it really was. I suspect she was telling my brother this in New Jersey. Maybe she thought he could handle it better. So my brother had a different idea about it than I did. But we went on for a long time like that. And it wasn't until really the last couple of years that my mother really started advocating for, look, I want to put dad somewhere else. I'm exhausted. I can't handle this. And it really became to be framed as a choice between the two of them. As awful as that sounds, it was sort of like, we have to get dad out of here or I'm going to have a heart attack. It literally, that was one thing that was said at one time. That was horrible to hear. And how can you choose between your parents? It's terrible. So then we did try briefly to commit him to an institution, a memory care facility, but not everyone is a successful candidate for an institution like that, and we either waited too long, or my father just wasn't a good candidate, or a combination of both those things, and he was rejected. He made it. We made two attempts, and they were a complete disaster. One facility, he made it through about 2 weeks. The other facility, he made it through about a month, and both times he was sent home. And whether it was intentional or not, he took a dive off a cliff after, theoretically at least after that time. It was like PTSD on steroids. Whether it was a result of the trauma of the facility or not, he deteriorated very quickly after that and only lived a few more months after he got out of the last facility.
Wow. I know, they say with the, changing of environments and so forth, it's not good either for, for the loved one. I know with my mom, we initially had her in a, in a home, and the thing about having her in a home, there's seven of us. So, um, I'm in Florida. The rest of them up in the DMV area where my mom was. So they would actually go into the nursing home and actually really take care of her. I mean, they would make sure she had her shower, make sure she was dressed, make sure she ate. Although they fed her, the food came from them and the medication came from them, but they were there just about every day to do that. And then, COVID came, and she contracted COVID. We really weren't told that she contracted COVID in the official way, but we did find out. So she had to go to the hospital, and then we brought her to stay at my brother's house in Virginia. So the care there was, it was, you know, the siblings, and me going up for a month at a time. So, and one thing we wanted to do was not move her to so many different places to, I don't know, I want to say distract, but distract is not the word. But, so she'd be aware of her surroundings and felt comfortable when be irritated, etc. So, and I know you said something about the fact that you think your brother may have known more about what was going on with your father than you. So, how were the family dynamics through the process?
Well, my brother and I, we love each other, but we don't like talk every day or even every week. Really, we're really different people. So I think what happened was, a lot of times with family dynamics, old biases from childhood and baggage come up, and the prevailing mentality in my family, right or wrong. Again, my parents were kind of old school about this. I being the girl, my brother being the boy, I was maybe perceived as, oh, she's too emotional to handle this news. Also, it was well known in my family that I was very close to my father. I loved him to distraction. He could do no wrong in my eyes. So I think some folks in my family equated that with, well, Betsy just can't handle hearing the truth about him. But Rob, on the other hand, he's the boy. Also, my brother was a lot more financially successful than I was. He had six-figure income at a young age and a huge big house and all of this kind of thing. So I think the mentality was, well, Rob should be the one to know all the financial details and the medical details. So Betsy, it's great that she's here for comfort, but I don't think she can handle knowing the nitty gritty, and we certainly don't want her to know, what's going on medically. And I would just charitably say, and I know that my mother didn't have a bad intention with this, but my big takeaway, having two children myself, now granted they're both boys, but they're very different. I could never conceive of why it would be a good idea to treat one of my siblings differently than the other when it would come to information sharing, particularly about myself. Unless, of course, there's maybe a problem like drug addiction or some really serious, like a criminal reason why you wouldn't want one of the siblings to know. But other than that, I think you're only hurting yourself and making it more difficult if you don't share information freely among the siblings that are there. Whether they're in state or out of state. Especially with me being in state, I would have been able to go to the doctor's appointments, but my mother avoided doing that, maybe trying to protect me, or maybe not wanting me to know how bad off he was. One appointment that she took me to, this was in the last year that he spent at home in 2021. She allowed me to go to one appointment, and in that appointment I distinctly remember the doctor saying, "Oh, Ed, we haven't seen you in a year." And I thought to myself, good Lord, a year? I mean, I knew my mother was struggling, but that was a clarion call right there. If you're if you've got a disease that involves mental decline, you really need to be monitored consistently by whoever your overseeing physician is, basically so they can calibrate your medication, because medication varies so greatly from person to person. How are you going to get those medication levels right? And it's so hard, isn't it, to get your patient in physically into the doctor's office when they're in the later stages. So this didn't happen by, of course, my mother's intent, but it happened. And because she hadn't wanted to share any of this information with me, I was powerless to help. I certainly could have taken him myself. I did take him on many errands and outings to give her a break, but never to the doctors. And that's where our care plan really went haywire, is not being able to calibrate his medications. So near the end, he was very hard to manage because of lack of medical oversight.
So now, um, did he become mobile, bedridden, and things of that nature, or was he always up and around?
No, eventually he did. I hate to say it this way. I hope, Mom, I hope you're not watching right now. I love you so much if you are, but I know you remember all this. It might have been easier in some ways if he were bedridden earlier, just in the sense of managing. I always likened it to a little child. He's becoming more and more like a little child. And sure, when you've got little children, I don't know how, anybody else's little children were, but they usually don't just like lay there and let you change them. They fight, right? They flail around and all this. They yell and they scream. They'd probably be swearing if they knew the words. But of course, when the patient is a lot bigger as an adult, they can really do some damage. Even though my father wasn't a big giant guy, he was a full grown man. So with that, he was able bodied until he went to the facilities, and that was a game changer. After he came home from the facilities, he had really been. You could see the effect of the trauma. He shuffled a lot. He wasn't bedridden yet, but that came very quickly. He was bedridden within 2 3 months after his last facility admission. And once he was bedridden, he only lived about another couple of months.
Wow, that's that's crazy. That's insane. It's like with the bedridden piece. How did your mom or you, when you came to visit, how were you able to give him his medication? Was he, "I've already taken my medication"? Did you have to crush it up? What did you put it in food? What did you have to do?
Yeah, all those things. Yeah, we did try all that. Before he became bedridden, it came to sort of a struggle. He was very suspicious after the facility admissions. He was very traumatized. He was still in a phase, unfortunately, where he was aware of what had happened to him, and sadly, he really blamed my mother for committing him. I mean, that is literally what happened, but he took it out on her personally. That was really terrible to witness. Ironically, my mother ended up making it much harder on herself without meaning to, by putting him in the facility. So that when he came home, he was very resistant to anything that she wanted to do, including the medication. So we tried a few things. We did try the pill crushing. We got a mortar and pestle, that little, it's like a cup with a big, thing in it, and you crush it up. So that worked. That worked pretty well for some of it. Of course, some of the pills had a bitter taste, and we put him in pudding because he loved pudding and he had sweet tooth. So that would usually, or ice cream, that usually worked pretty well. Some things we could put in a liquid, but there again, if we'd had better routes of communication with the doctor, I think we could have gotten maybe some different. I don't know if a pain patch would have worked for him. We'll never know that, unfortunately, but I thought that could have been an option if we had been in better communication with the doctor. But doctors probably could have advised us better about, hey, this is a better format to try to give him this or that. It was really a lot of experimentation. Then when he became bedridden, it got to the point of giving him things in dropperfuls. He could still take liquids and ice cream and pudding, but eventually he stopped taking any liquids or medication at all, and it was like dropperful until like that last horrible few days when he basically just starved and to death, or through lack of liquids. That was really horrific to see. That stayed with me.
Yeah. And for our audience that's watching this, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will respond to them or bring up your comments during the conversation. I know with my mom, we used the crusher, and we would crush the pills up, put it in her food. Even when it was when she couldn't take the solids, you had to blend it all up and like that. We would put it in there, put it in. She loved the pudding. For some reason, I found a trend of a lot of people that I've spoken to so far on the show is that sweets. For some reason, sweets. I mean,
Yeah,
they love the sweets.
same.
Yeah, so we crush it up, of course, and put it in the pudding and applesauce and all that stuff as well. So that was good. What about the you know, bathing and taking showers? How was your mom able to do that? Because I'm assuming they were around the same age.
Mhm. Oh my gosh, yeah, Janet, that was terrible. And my mother was in decent physical health, but that was just a big nightmare too. We for a while we had one volunteer, wasn't a paid
Mhm.
caregiver, but he was a volunteer, a guy, like an older guy. My dad related really well to other men. Like he liked to pal around with the guys, kind of. And he would. This guy's name was Michael, and so Michael and Dad would go and hang out together, and Dad would usually do what Michael said. So that really helped for a while. But one day came when my dad had a horrific bathroom accident involving like a big messy bowel movement at home, and Michael was just completely overwhelmed and no help. And my mother said after that, you know what? We're beyond the point that Michael can help us. We need someone that has medical knowledge to do this. And she tried for a while to get a guy caregiver, but those were in really short supply. Like a younger guy that had some strength to compel my father, those were almost impossible to find. So we had to have just female caregivers, but they had to kind of like strong arm my father because he really fought that. And like I said, I always likened it to how a little child would fight you if you were trying to change them. But of course, it's a lot harder with a big person. And I think there may even be like they're sort of unspooling what they've learned. And I think that each kids learn maybe early on like a sense of it. I don't know if it's so much shame, but when you're hiding your private parts or whatever, like they really feel like they need to protect themselves when someone's trying to either pull their pants down or whatever. So they're very frightened. They're very frightened of that, and so that was a terrible problem. But one thing I saw in a brief hospitalization when my dad had to be briefly hospitalized when my mother basically was overwhelmed and had him taken to a hospital for a weekend, they put these mitts on him, and those were a game changer. Boy, did I wish we knew about them earlier. They're like cloth mitts that go on your whole hand. You wrap them around the wrist, and they're just basically there. I mean, I think little babies use them to keep from scratching their nails, but these kept him from being able to like fight or grip our hands when he was being changed. They were fantastic. But and we so she ordered a pair the next day on Amazon. Bam, we had them. We only put them on him, of course, to change, but they worked like a charm. But we didn't get a pair of those until the very end. So changing was a pretty miserable experience. It required by the time he was in a hospital bed, my mother on one side, me on the other, and the daily paid caregiver that we had, a young lady. We usually had like about two that were regulars that were used to the drill, as it were. And one would come in the morning, one would come in the evening, and it took 15 or 20 minutes. It was pretty horrible. He would cry, he would try to fight us. It was just so awful to watch, but it had to be done because he was starting to get like a diaper rash basically from not being changed. So we had to endure that like twice a day. My mother was very, very stoic during these times, and she really had to direct the whole procedure. Okay, do this, everybody roll him to this side. She had a whole situation where she would pull out the soiled sheet and put the other one under it. And it was amazing how she had this thing organized. So we didn't even have to change the whole bed, just a pad that was under him, and his clothes. And she had like tearaway, pants, whatever. It was all down to a science. But before that, that's the thing that really almost broke her, is like having to get him to the toilet and having him try to fight her constantly on it. Oh my God. And as his daughter, as much as I wanted to help, he still had a lingering awareness that it was me, and is very uncomfortable for his dignity. If my brother had been around, maybe he would have reacted differently, but he wasn't. It was just me. So that was a terrible torture for my mother, and only a paid caregiver could really help.
And I think they do still have that shame, dignity,
Yeah.
point of view. Because I know my mom, I think she it's almost, this is just how the perception I had is that, I've been doing this, I don't need you, to change me, or something like that. But of course, we had to. um Here's a question that came over: was your mother able to take time off, you know over the weekend or something?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, hey Jackie, I see you. Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, that my mother did so much. I feel like I did, so little compared to her, but that was where I really came in handy. Like, I loved my father so much and I had so much empathy for him. For me, after, everything my mother suffered, for me, it seemed like it was so little, like the literally least I could do to stand in there for the time that it would take her. She would rarely go away for a weekend. She wouldn't do that. But she would at least go away for a day. There were some local retreats. She had like a good caregiver support network and she would go to those. And then I would come and stay with dad for those times. And honestly, those were some of my like cherished times when I felt like I could give something back after everything he'd given to me. It was just really simple stuff. I'd sit there and watch a movie with him, maybe play some favorite music. It was nothing compared to what my mother did, but yeah, we definitely encouraged her to do that.
That's awesome. I also want to go back to the mittens you were talking about, because with all the episodes I've had, I've never heard anyone talk about the mittens. So that is something that's, people can use as well if they have, the fighting parent, as I call it. My mom, that probably would have been good for us, but she probably would have figured out how to take it off.
He
She had
tried,
these,
yeah.
she had these fingernails, and yes, we would keep her nails trimmed, but it was just this one finger with this one nail. If she got you with that nail, it was,
Oh.
pretty painful. And then we had to. She had a. I always say she had a good right hook as well, because if you come over there, it's like,
Gosh,
what are you
Janet.
coming over here for? And you would think that she wouldn't be as strong as she was during that time, but it's like she was pretty strong. But those things were. But that's a good idea with the mittens. And then I know with the changing of her, I've had to change my mom several times, of course, also with my siblings as well. And it was just me by myself. And and you have to know how to, pull them over, make sure they're comfortable, and be able to, move things from, under them, and all of that kind of stuff. And then we talked to her to let her know, okay, mom, we're gonna turn you over, because one thing I found is that when we just went to change to turn her over, and you didn't tell her, that made her more agitated. And then the nails in the arm may be trying to come up. But when we spoke to her and said, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, that made it a little easier sometimes. So that was great as well. Now, Kat, when you we have Cheryl Ann, she put a link in there. She said she think that those are the mittens you were talking about. So thank you, Cheryl Ann. That's awesome. Now, what else would you say? Like, so when your mom, went out and you had the opportunity to stay with him, I mean, what was that like for you? I mean, this is your dad. You're very close to him. You remember him doing all these things, but yet now he's, incapable of doing these things. What was your mind? What was your thought process?
Oh, this overwhelming sense of empathy and protectiveness, much like I imagine like what people feel. I mean, I did have sons, so like what I imagine that I felt like when my kids were little, like just wanting to protect them. He was so childlike to me. He was a wonderful father. I was very fortunate that I know it's sad. Like in a lot of families, sometimes there's baggage or bad blood between parents and their kids, and maybe kids don't feel that same way. But my father was a wonderful, loving father, demonstrative, and just gave me a wonderful childhood. And all I wanted to do was protect him, love him. He was very affectionate, and so I to show love, it was natural for me. I just wanted to, comfort him and play the songs that I knew that he loved. We had shared music for a long time because he taught me all of the great standards to sing, all the jazz standards. He would play on the piano and I would sing them. So we already had that. He couldn't play the piano in the end of his life, and that was terrible too. But he still had a lot of recordings, including some recordings of himself singing. He was a fabulous
Wow.
singer, like Robert Goulet. He had a great voice. So, we had a lot of recordings to listen to, and we had a tablet that had some recorded like old radio shows like Bob Hope, stuff like that, and like holiday radio shows and old TV programs like classic stuff like on TV Land, like Green Acres and some other stuff that Little Rascals and things like that. That I think it was just comforting. I think it brought him back to his childhood. And there were even these slideshows on the tablet. It was like preloaded content for seniors. And they were such simple things like these slideshows of, believe it or not, the one about babies. He loved that thing. Like it was just slides about babies with comforting music and slides about dogs. He loved dogs and nature. These things you could put these like nature slideshows on, and they were like really comforting for him. So that really helped a lot. I just most of all, I just wanted to be there by his side. One of the best books that I read in my journey, it was called The Problem of Alzheimer's. It's by Dr. Jason Karlawish. I love it. It's very policy heavy, like it's a little wonky. In some portions it talks about all the politics behind how we got where we are, but he has a lot of empathy, and the very end of the book, the last line of it has become like my personal mantra. It's literally three words: in solitude, company. And to me, that sums it all up. At the end of your life, whether you got Alzheimer's, whether you got cancer, whether you got, what more can you give than that? Be there, just be there. It's what I'd want. It's what I wanted to give him, and I think that's enough sometimes.
I think so. And it's good that you use the tools that he loved, the music and all of that. I know, with my mom was a singer, and we would just, my siblings and we would just get there and start singing, and then she would start singing, and we're looking at each other and tears are coming down. It's like, I can't believe she's remembering the words to the song, but she remembered the words for the most part to the songs. And if you read her like Bible scriptures and stuff like that, she would be saying the scriptures as you're reading them. So that part of her wasn't wasn't gone. It was still there, and those memories were still tucked back there in her memory, in her brain somewhere. So that's awesome, and that's something that I would recommend to anyone that is caring for their loved one. What did they like? Those are the things you need to use to kind of calm them down. One thing I know with, when we were trying to get my mom to take a shower and, going back and forth, I've already taken one. No, you haven't. We changed that and we said, okay, you want to go to church? Yes, I want to go to church. Okay, so let's go take your shower and let's get dressed and, stuff like that. So sometimes you have to use things that they love to do in order to get them to do the things that, you need for them to do now. So, as far as your brother, did he ever come down during this time, or was it mainly just you and your mom?
He did come a few times. And again, Rob, if you ever watch this, you know how much I love you and how much I'm so thankful for everything that you did. Because Rob had a lot of strength at certain times that really helped my mom along. She relied on him a lot, especially for the financial stuff. But it amounted to, he basically came down at certain times to be the strong man. He was going to come down to strong arm dad into the facility. That was usually the plan. He came down at the couple of times when my mother had made the decision that dad was going to go hell or high water into this facility, and that's what had to happen. So she knew she couldn't do this by herself, physically, and I think to some degree emotionally. And so she called Rob to come down, and he did. So that's what happened. Those two disastrous times that dad had to go into a facility. Rob came down from New Jersey, took him to the facility, boom, and then he left. And that's what happened, the first time and the second time.
Okay. So, if you had to tell someone that's, caring for their loved one, what would you tell them to look out for, or what recommendations would you have for them?
Well, number one, I would say the earlier you can get a diagnosis, the more options you're going to have. Whether you have dementia or not, everybody is going to die of something. And if you're fortunate, you're going to get to be old. And do you really want your kids, your loved ones, to struggle with guessing about what you might have wanted? I hope you would say no. So, with that, literally the first best thing you can do for yourself is every time that you get a wellness check, seriously, starting in your mid 50s. I mean, I'm 55 and I'm bugging my doctor about it, although I have perfect memory scores. Have that conversation in your wellness visit. Hey, doc, my memory, what can I do to, just have the verbal conversation. There's very simple written tests that can be done. Once you establish a benchmark, you're going to know, your doctor will know, by your next benchmark, have you had a drastic departure from that? You don't have to get an MRI or a PET scan to know that. Of course, if you have already memory concerns, you're going to be going in there to find that out. But really being proactive in your diagnosis is the most important thing I think you can do. And committing your wishes to paper. I mean, if you're in your 50s, most people would say you should have a will by now. So if you feel like you should have a will at that age, why the heck wouldn't you want to, give your family some instructions? Most people have what do they call the do not resuscitate order, or donating your organs kind of directive. Well, this is very much like that. Tell your family, put it on paper. What would you want if you were mentally incapacitated? Do you want to be remaining in your home for as long as you can? And if the answer to that is yes, then the onus is really on you to make sure that's realistic. You can't just say, "Oh, well, I want my family to take care of me at home." If I don't have a home, or you don't have any money, or your kids are 1,000 miles away from you, you really have to be realistic about that. What's realistic for you? So I would say, like, have that conversation with all of your loved ones that are part of your care circle, whether that's your siblings or your kids. Put that on paper. That's maybe the most important thing you can do. And again, the sharing of information, it's just, not sharing it seems like it causes a lot more problems than sharing the information. And it's always going to come down to, one person's going to do more than another person. But knowing the information, how can you do anything if you don't really know the facts? So I would want both my sons to know everything that happens with me medically. So I say, make sure that your kids, your loved ones, have access to your medical records. Again, unless there's a really good reason why you don't want one of them to know, or maybe they're a drug addict, something like that. Otherwise, share the information as much as you can.
And what about arrangements? Um, that day is coming. Your loved one has this disease, they're declining. Did you all prepare for those arrangements beforehand, or was that like at the later end?
Oh no, the funeral arrangements. Ironically, my parents had that all mapped out. They were, yeah. The funeral arrangements. That was kind of like sort of, I guess, the easiest part. I don't know. They had no problem saying, okay, I want to be cremated, this and that. That's after, of course, all the care is said and done. The hard part is the care journey, right? And I just saw one of my friends put in the chat there. That's her mother had made her promise to not take her in, and that's a gift right there, to know that. If your parents said that to you, then you know that. I mean, I didn't ever hear my father saying that, so that was
Mhm.
problematic. And in fact, he said exactly the opposite. A terrible point came when he asked me if he could just sleep on my floor in a cardboard box. Oh my God, that was heartbreaking. And we literally did go through a phase where we tried. I offered. I said, "Mom, I can take him in here." One of my sons was about to go in the Navy, and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna have an extra room here." But again, my father was too far gone to make any transition by that point. We still would have needed hired care, and I was still working full time, so it didn't work out. But as my friend pointed out in the chat here, if you can tell your kid, definitively one way or the other something that you want, that's helpful.
Yes, and make sure it's in writing, so there won't be any, you disagreeing about what was to be done as well. So I know that's one thing we did. We had already planned and made the arrangements for my mom some years ago. She passed away last July, so we had it all planned. So when that time came, we really didn't have too much to do. So you're going to be grieving and all of this, so not having to deal with that stuff. Of course, you still have to go to the funeral homes and and do that stuff. But overall, it just made it so much easier to just have it all planned the way that it should be.
Mhm.
So, but that's great, and I thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey, your family's journey with us. You know, it takes a lot of courage to come out, in public and on live Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram and LinkedIn to tell your story, your private story. But I believe it's really good so people can learn and let people know that they're not the only ones that's going through this or have gone through this. And whatever we can do to help, guide them or just be there for them is very helpful as well. Because there was a lot of stuff that we didn't know. There's a lot of stuff that we did know. I had a sister-in-law who's a nurse, and I have a sister that's a nurse, and a couple sisters that work in the medical field, you know, but still we didn't know everything. Everyone didn't agree on the same thing, but we made it knowing that everyone had the same goal, was to make her as comfortable and as, you know, as possible. So, but thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate it. And take care.
Thank you so much, Janet. It's been an honor. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. So, everyone, thank you again for joining us this evening. We had a great conversation with Betsy, and I hope that some of the information that we shared will be useful and helpful for you. If you would like to be a guest on Dementia Diaries, a caregiver's journey, please reach out to us at Dementia Diaries Podcast at gmail.com, or you can leave a text message at 813-894-8617. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good night.